And now on Book TV, we're live with author and Manhattan Institute fellow Heather McDonald. Her books include The Burden of Bad Ideas, The War on Cops, and most recently, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture.
Our strength, and what is literally unique among major countries around the world, is our diversity.
We're going to see people of merit rise up from every race, faith, corner of this country, because that's America's strength.
Our diversity is our strength, but our unity is our power.
We must also recommit to building a world where diversity and difference are promoted and celebrated.
I think that what's important is that as a leader, he speak up on behalf of the rights of all Americans and the respect we should show for the diversity of our country, which I think is one of our great strengths.
Heather McDonald, author of The Diversity Delusion. When you hear that phrase, diversity is our strength, what comes to mind?
Well, it kind of makes me want to throw up, frankly, Peter, because it is so darn hypocritical. They don't really mean it. They're defining diversity in the most narrow, constricting way, which is gonads and melanin, which is not relevant, as far as I'm concerned, to somebody's worldview, to their beliefs, to their aspirations in life. And they're talking about basically race and gender quotas. The idea of, say, intellectual diversity is foreign to them. This is just a code word for a form of identity politics that I think is extremely dangerous and poisonous for our society.
Isn't it important, though, that, as you say, gonads and melanin are included when we look at a group of people?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I could not care less what the gender is of a lab working on Alzheimer's disease, say. Unfortunately, right now, our national government does, and it is pressuring every scientific department in the country, in a university, and private scientific firms as well, to hire based on gender, because the mantra now coming out of the National Science Foundation is the only good science is diverse science. Do I really care who discovers the cure for Alzheimer's disease? I do not. And I am not going to assume that I know your views based on your skin color or your gender. I am so sick of this prefix now that comes about every statement in our identity-obsessed world, which is, well, as a woman, XYZ, or even better, as a black woman, XYZ, or best of all, as a trans black woman, XYZ. None of that follows. I'm going to treat everybody as an individual, but that is not what the diversity rhetoric is about.
Heather McDonald, how did we get here?
Difficult. It's easier to describe the trajectory than to understand the cause. All I know is that when I was in college in the 1970s, there was some crazy literary theory going around, which I unfortunately fell for, something called Deconstruction, post-structuralism. It said some very weird things about language, literature, meaning, humans. But I was so fortunate to be in college in the 70s because I got to read the greatest works of English literature without anybody thinking to complain that, say, as a female, I was somehow in an unsafe space reading John Milton or reading William Wordsworth. I got to immerse myself in language and in beauty, in sublimity, without regard to the race or gender of the authors. The 80s changed everything. You had the rise of a virulent, radical multiculturalism on college campuses, women's studies, gender studies, that started to teach students that they were entitled to reject some of the greatest works of civilization, works that they had not a clue about, simply because of the authors or creators or the painters or philosophers were of the wrong race or gender. You know, we saw the civil rights movement, which to its credit, fought against centuries of American bigotry on behalf of the rights of the individual. In the 1960s, that started changing into a much more radical and nihilistic Black power politics. I think that was something that was moving into the colleges as well. And the women's stuff, it rode on the coattails of the civil rights movement, I think, improperly, and went into the same narrow, constricting, poisonous realm of defining people on the basis of race and gender.
And from your book, The Diversity Delusion, you write that colleges across the country are creating what tort law calls eggshell plaintiffs, preternaturally fragile individuals injured by the slightest collusions with life.
True, absolutely. I mean, they purport to be unsafe on a college campus. Can I just remind your viewers and you, Peter, how ridiculous this idea is? You have students now, it is impossible to overstate the degree of maudlin caterwauling. They will say, as a Yale student, I am at risk of my lives from circumambient racism and sexism. This is crazy. There has never been a more tolerant, more opportunity-filled environment in human history than a college campus. It is filled with the most well-meaning faculty who want all of their students to succeed, in particular, society's traditionally oppressed groups. And yet, students are being encouraged by this growing diversity bureaucracy to think of themselves as victims and to celebrate their victimhood. There is a ruthless competition underway on every college campus today to be the top dog victim. These days, that position, glorified, sought after, is occupied by trans individuals, but that won't last. Anybody who can guess the next top dog victim is more far-seeing than I, but gets the prize, because the students are desperate to find some way to trump the current totem pole of victimhood.
Now, Heather McDonald, isn't there some legitimacy in women's studies, African American studies, to tell those stories in history as well?
I don't think they should be separate disciplines. We tell them all the time. Novels tell the story of women, of blacks, with extraordinary empathy. Huck Finn does. I just read the book Slaves of Solitude, set in post-World War II Britain. Incredible insights into female sexual competitiveness. Of course, we should open our history. We should understand reality in as great and broad a way as possible. But the reality is this, Peter. Those separate studies departments, whether it's Black studies, Chinkantz, Latinx studies, women's studies, they have become grievance factories. They are not about openness. They are about cultivating a very particular mindset, which is one that is at war with the accomplishments of Western civilization.
So when you speak on a college campus, what's your reception?
It's varied. At times, it's been rather hostile, physically so, brute force. Other times, it's merely tense. But other times, students have listened respectfully and asked questions. At the University of Pennsylvania recently, it was a challenging audience, but they were all respectful. There was no interruptions. I was recently at the University of Colorado Boulder, there too. Now that was a mixed audience. There were a lot of people, adults from the community, so they were very receptive to my message. But there was some faculty there that were insulted by the fact that I actually said that there are no bigots at the University of Colorado. This is the very weird thing about our current moment, Peter. There is nothing more insulting you can say to a college administrator than, your institution is filled with good people. There are no bigots there. Because they want to say this is a bigoted environment. It is a very perverse situation where you have elite, liberal institutions voluntarily embracing the narrative that they discriminate, when this is empirically, demonstrably false. So I was at University of Colorado Boulder, had a, they did a wonderful job inviting me. Nevertheless, for me to say that this is an open-minded institution was seen by some people there as an insult. Go figure.
But what's the advantage to saying it's not an open environment?
That's a fabulous question. If one was starting from scratch, not knowing the whole victim ideology that we live in, it's absolutely puzzling. And yet there is a bureaucracy in every university today, and it's not confined to the elite colleges, it's now trickling down, sadly, even into community colleges, that is invested, its entire well-being is dependent on this idea that there is institutional racism on college campuses. And there are people whose identity, again, if you're doing Black studies, possibly you are reading Ralph Ellison and Du Bois with an ear for just their language and greatness. But the far greater likelihood is what you are telling students is that the Enlightenment itself, which was all about tolerance, is a source of racism and bigotry, which is historically false. But these departments are invested in this narrative that America remains endemically, permanently racist and sexist. This is Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is probably the best paid college speaker today. He is beloved by every college administrator because his message is that the identity of America, not just 200 years ago, but today, is to destroy the Black body. And that is a message which colleges perversely welcome and encourage, and they don't want to hear a counter-narrative.
Back to the diversity delusion, you quote Peter Uven, Vice President of Academic Affairs at Claremont McKenna College in California. I fully understand that people have strong opinions and different, often painful experiences with the issues Heather McDonald discusses. I also understand that words can hurt. Why did you include that in the book?
Well, I guess I wanted to give a full picture of what happened at Claremont McKenna.
What happened?
Which was a blockade, a student blockade of about 250 students that surrounded the auditorium where I was supposed to speak about my previous book, The War on Cops, which simply tries to give voice to the hundreds of people whom I've had the privilege to meet in high crime neighborhoods, whether it's South Central Los Angeles or Central Harlem, who are law-abiding, they want their children to succeed, and they support the cops. They want public order, they want the same freedom from fear that people in other neighborhoods can take for granted. And they say to the cops, why aren't you getting the kids off the street? Why aren't you getting the drug dealers off the corner? So I wanted to give voice to those people, to give an alternative story to the Black Lives Matter narrative. Well, this was viewed as something that was not tolerable, not allowable on Claremont McKenna campus by the students and those from the neighboring Claremont colleges like Pomona, Scripps, and Pitzer, Harvey Mudd. And so hours before I was supposed to speak, students started congregating outside of the auditorium, and it was so, this is just classic of student sort of wallowing in their lachrymose self-pity. Their rule for the blockade was that the Black students would be on the inner ring because otherwise they were so at risk from Claremont's feckless police, the Claremont College's feckless police forces, that somehow they'd come in with billy clubs and just would be beating them. So the students believed that my presence there as a racist, sexist, Islamophobe, warphobe, transphobe. I mean, it's the usual litany of substitutions for thought and for engagement that the fascist McDonald had to be shut down. Well, Peter Uven, one of the deans, was trying to sort of, I don't know, thread the needle and throw them as a sop to say, well, of course, this is somehow threatening rhetoric or makes people feel unsafe, or, you know, which is just ridiculous. We should not be playing into this absurd conceit. There are millions of students abroad in Asia right now, Peter, who are studying night and day for the privilege of attending an American college, this alleged maelstrom of hatred. They're students of color. Why do they want to come here? Because they understand that an American college today offers boundless opportunities. You can read every book that has ever been written. This is something that would have driven the Renaissance humanists mad with envy and desire. And yet these students are being taught to think of themselves as victims. It is educational malpractice.
Has there been another period in our history, Heather McDonald, where identity politics has played such a large role?
Interesting question. Obviously, to our original sin was slavery and de jure desegregation. That was identity politics. That because of the color of your skin, you were not granted the protections of the Constitution. And we fought a civil war to try and remedy that profound violation of our founding ideals. Now, the Civil War didn't end things, obviously, because parts of America held on very tenaciously to their identity politics. But I would argue today that we have very largely overcome that. There's not a single mainstream institution today that is not bending over backwards to hire and promote both as many people of color as possible and females. You know, what we had in the 20th century, instead of identity politics, I'd actually rather go back to the traditional leftism of Marxism. To me, it's sort of more interesting to divide the world into, say, capitalists, railroad barons, workers, farmers. Those are more interesting categories than race and gender. That's an accomplishment. That's something you do. But the identity politics is really taking us back to a period in American history which I think we should all be happy to have left.
Journalist Deborah Dickerson, writing about you in Mother Jones in 2008, said that you are among America's harshest critics of blacks, harshest and most devastating, unlike most of the right-wing blogosphere. Homegirl does her homework.
Well, I don't know about harshest critics of blacks. I would say I'm a critic of an ideology that is going to guarantee further racial inequality. I am a critic of any type of culture that is counterproductive, that disparages academic effort, the bourgeois values of deferred gratification. And so I'm certainly a critic of race hustling, but I'm surprised she wrote that, because I think that is completely inaccurate.
When you read this article, though, and this was written back in 2008, have you met Deborah Dickerson?
No, I haven't.
It's a real backhanded compliment.
Oh,
to
sure.
You.
It was.
It's a very favorable article in the sense that basically she says you come prepared,
Right.
and that the left has to prepare to debate you.
Well, yeah, it does help to look at statistics, because as I've done, looking at statistics about crime, about police shootings, say, demolishes the Black Lives Matter narrative that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased shootings, police shootings of black men. So I'm always happy to debate numbers.
Heather McDonald, two of the things you take on in your most recent book, The Diversity Delusion, are Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. Isn't the Me Too movement an important social movement?
Well, to the extent that, yes, it confines itself to sexual predation in the workplace, which is a reality, and shames men into acting like gentlemen, that is something that is very valuable. But it immediately morphed, not surprisingly, into yet just another pitch for gender quotas. And so you now have, again, the Hollywood, you have the music industry. They are quite explicitly saying we are going to nominate, award, prize based on gender. Any institution now that is going to dare put out a slate of anybody for anything that is not 50-50 male-female is asking for trouble. And the other thing is, again, like, I support males acting like gentlemen and having a sense of chivalry and restraint, and females acting responsibly and modestly. But the Me Too movement, to the extent that it is still invested in a sexual liberationist view, is going to be a little conflicted in what it says is the ideal male behavior. So again, I think that we had norms of sexual behavior that before sexual liberation came about, acknowledged the differences between the male and female libidos. Those were all thrown aside in sexual liberation on the assumption that they were somehow oppressive to females. And we have now a situation that is great for males, you know, the campus hookup scene on college campuses, where there's no default against premarital sex. And females, if they don't want to have a drunken hookup with a guy they barely know, have to argue their way out of the default yes. That, I don't think, is a particularly advantageous situation to females who react differently to casual sex, to intercourse. It produces physiological, biological, hormonal responses in females that are different in males. It produces more of a desire for emotional bonding. And the hookup culture that says females should regard sex with as casual an attitude as males do is something that I think is contrary to nature and is not in the best interests of females.
It's a lonely job, you write, working the phones at a college rape crisis center. Day after day, you wait for the casualties to show up from the campus rape epidemic, but few victims call. Could this mean that the crisis is overblown? No, it means, according to the campus sexual assault industry, that the abuse of co-eds is worse than anyone has ever imagined.
Exactly. This is, again, this is another paradox, Peter, of our college campuses today. Just as you would think that a college would welcome being told, there's no bigots here. You guys are not, you know, some Jim Crow slaveholders. You're open-minded, tolerant people. You would also think that a college would welcome when it has low reported rapes. Who wants to be a rape haven? You know, who wants to be a scene of violence of an unprecedented proportion, which is what these campus rape statistics are telling us? The meme that the Obama administration picked up that was long in play on college campuses, which is that 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 females will be sexually assaulted during their college years. That is a level of sexual violence that is almost unheard of anywhere in the globe today. You can look at Detroit, which is America's most violent city, and if you combine all 4 violent felonies which the FBI tracks, which is murder, rape, aggravated assault, and robbery, you get a grand total annually of 2%. The rapes are in the 0.01 something. So 20% to 25% over 4 years is just mind-boggling. So you would think a college would welcome that girls are not reporting campus rapes. But when the campus rape bureaucrat at Yale was asked, well, Harvard has 30 rapes, they have more rapes than you. The Yale rape bureaucrat was very defensive and said, well, they must be overcounting, you know, because we wish we had that many rapes. It was as if somebody was ragging them about the latest Harvard-Yale game or something. The fact of the matter is that if this tsunami of sexual violence were going on, instead of a stampede of females to get into college, which is the reality we're seeing, a stampede that grows more and more frenzied every year, you would have seen a stampede of girls to get out of college. You would have seen a movement decades ago to create more single-sex schools where females can study in safety, free from this pall of campus rape. You would not see, I assume, because I'm going to assume that females have some degree of intelligence and some degree of solidarity to warn themselves off, to be strong women together, which we're supposed to believe in. If that were the case, you would not see on every Saturday night the co-eds trooping off down Rugby Road at UVA to the frats, or any other school to the frats, if these in fact were dens of rape. Because I'm going to assume that females know how to protect themselves, and they keep going in.
You earlier on said you fell for X kind of language in your college career. What does deconstructionism mean, and what do you mean when you say you fell for it?
Oh dear, it's so crazy, Peter. It's so arcane, but it was in one sense the root of what happened later, at least as far as a rhetorical gesture. Deconstruction was this theory about language and literature that came out of France in the 1960s, 1970s. Its main progenitor was a French so-called philosopher named Jacques Derrida. And he had an aura of European sophistication around him. And he wrote prose of utter impenetrable jargon. Yale, where I was an undergraduate, was the counterpart to Jacques Derrida at the Sorbonne. And Derrida would come every year trailing his white silk scarf, trailing acolytes of graduate students starry-eyed. And Yale was the place to be. Deconstruction embraced some very odd propositions about language. It said that language always failed, that language was about itself. It never referred outside of itself because language consists of a set of arbitrary signs. There's no natural relationship between the word for dog and a dog. In French, it's chien. In German, it's Hund. These are all arbitrary. Because the verbal sign is arbitrary, that somehow deconstruction concluded, therefore we can't mean anything. And that literature is only about itself. It's not about trying to express the human dilemma. It's not about trying to discuss love and loss. It's about its own failure to mean. And the real kicker, the weirdest thing about deconstruction was it said there is no such thing as the human self. The human self is just a trope of language. It's just a rhetorical fiction. Well, why would anybody believe this? It's contradicted by daily experience that you and I are talking, and I understand you, and I think you probably understand me, and I hope your listeners understand us. I think they do. We know that human beings are more than language, and yet I had been interested always. In high school, I was attracted to language. I loved Faulkner because the language was so ripe and strange. And I loved Melville for the same reason, just these incredible flights of description about the water and the whale. And this seemed like it was the hottest thing happening. It was the thing to do. So I fell for it. And I wasted so much time in college trying to understand Derrida's Mythologie Blanche and Heidegger, time that should have been spent reading more novels, reading history. But the one thing about deconstruction is it did teach you to pay very close attention to language. You were doing it for the wrong reason. You were doing it to find where text broke down. But we read closely. And as I say, it was also a Mandarin science because we read the canon. Nobody, Paul de Man, who was the counterpart to Derrida, although very different personality at Yale, he read Rousseau, he read Plato, he read Heine, he read Kleist. For weird reasons, he read Shelley, but he read them. And again, this was pre-identity politics, so I was glad for that. Now, the language of deconstruction, which is highly mannered, it was this weird self-involved rhetoric that then gave rise in a weird, perverse way, because you then had the self rising up like a phoenix in multiculturalism and saying literary studies is only about the self. Now students only want to study themselves as a female. It was a weird turn of events. So you had the idea that the self is a fiction being jettisoned, but the language of deconstruction held on, and so all the stuff about narrativity, that's all still with us, alas.
So did that make you, in a sense, a leftist, a progressive? Were your politics influenced by this deconstructionism?
No, my politics were influenced by simply growing up in the America, on the coasts. You know, I grew up in LA. I went to school on the East Coast. Those were environments where liberalism was simply the default. And I did not have the desire, the impetus, whatever, to think my way out of the default. Some students did, obviously, but I was just a unthinking, not particularly political, but I know that I very much absorbed. I remember when a bike of mine got stolen from in front of the Yale Law School when I was back there as a graduate student. My view was I didn't deserve that bike. I had an early intimation, this was in the 80s before people really came up with the idea of white privilege, but I guess I believed it that, well, somehow I had no right to that bicycle. How can I complain? So I think it was, deconstruction was not particularly political. It became, when it became identity politics, that's when the politics came in.
When you were growing up in Southern California, though, there was a relatively solid mix of conservatives and liberals, weren't there?
Yes. I was in a school that had a lot of Hollywood kids, but my school actually was not particularly political. I'm very grateful for that. It was, we did our science projects and we studied the Krebs cycle and read Huck Finn. So I don't recall that. I think it was probably more in high school and just the assumption of college. But that's, I've never really thought about that, is where really it was communicated.
What kind of work did your parents do?
My father was a lawyer who ended up managing a trust, an estate, and had some commercial real estate with other owners in Los Angeles. And so he was sort of, ended up being, he didn't practice law, more of a solo practitioner. And my mother, I'm very grateful, she was a homeowner, a home worker, what's the term?
Homemaker.
Homemaker, a mother. And even more importantly, both my parents read to me, and they understood the value of these great children's books, the great English tradition of children's literature, of Wind in the Willows, of Winnie the Pooh, the E. Nesbit tales, Railroad Children. And so I was allowed to fill my head with these amazing stories of innocence, of irony. I mean, the writing of the British children's literature tradition is so sophisticated. The language is so rich. The descriptions of nature are so brilliant, but it's also so cozy. The stories of the animals that are personified. So she read to me, my father taught me to read very early on, read the Tolkien books, Captain's Courageous. So that was, I think, probably a very important thing in my upbringing.
Master's degree from Cambridge, or a postgraduate degree from Cambridge, and a law degree from Stanford.
Well, it took me a long time to get the theory bug out of my system. I came back to Yale. What really turned me on academically, and again, I apologize if this is getting into the weeds here of academics, but I studied linguistics in Cambridge in England. And that was language. That was the study of language. And I fell in love with something called speech act theory, which was the creation of a British analytic philosopher named J.L. Austin, how to do things with words. This was the antidote to deconstruction. Deconstruction says language always fails. Language breaks down. It's all about itself. You can't communicate. J.L. Austin noticed that there are certain types of sentences that are not descriptive. They're not true or false. It's not like to say, well, that table is broken. We can determine, is that true or false? It's false. Instead, there's certain sentences that do things. The criterion of truth and falsity doesn't apply. So if I say, I, Peter, take you as my married husband, and we're in a proper environment where we can exchange marriage vows, that statement is not true or false. It has changed the world. We have made a contract. Or if I christen this ship, the HMS Peter, that is not a true or false statement. With that statement, I have changed the world. I've done something with words. And Austin developed this interesting typology of different things you can do with words. John Searle, a philosopher at Berkeley, was the American version of doing speech act theory. So this was a completely different view of language. I love syntax, I love studying phonetics, but I nevertheless had been determined that I would go back to Yale to start a PhD in comparative literature, because I could think of nothing greater in one's life than to be given the responsibility of reading these great works and to be the person who passes on this inheritance to students, to be able to sit in Sterling Library of Yale and read Edmund Spencer. This is the greatest thing one can aspire to. So I wanted to go back to Yale, and because it was still, I still had the deconstruction bug in me a little bit. I got back and I heard my professors who I had revered as an undergraduate. They were saying the same things as they said when I left, and I heard it as a form of madness. I heard Paul DeMond talking about Shelley, mutilation Shelley. I thought, this is crazy. So I left, I quit, but I still was interested in the study of language and interpretation. So I went to law school, not because I wanted to be a lawyer, but it turns out there was sort of a legal version of deconstruction that was hot in the 80s, something called critical legal studies, which looked at legal texts, not as things that accomplish things, but as, again, as sort of language products that were, now we're getting very political. When you get into critical legal studies, things are getting very political. They are interested in an oppression narrative, and they're seeing legal text as a form of oppression. But I was interested still in the study of interpretation. How do we read text? How do we read the Constitution? We're talking about this all the time, you know, the whole originalism debate. It's an interesting debate. How do we determine what the Constitution means? Do we try and get the access to the founders? Can we get access to the founders' intention? These are interesting philosophical questions. Do any of us really know what that group of men meant? But maybe it's not even relevant. All of these questions that come up in the law, I was thinking about in a literary context. So that's why I went to law school, which was not a good reason to go to law school necessarily. It's a better reason if you want to actually become a lawyer. When I went to the law library the first time, my heart sunk. It was a whole bunch of case books on the shelves that are very, it's not literature, but I stuck it out.
Did you ever practice law?
Not much. I clerked for the most liberal judge in the country, Stephen Reinhardt, who he viewed me. He later said I was the clerk who went, his only clerk who went bad, because I did eventually become more conservative. But he was a very sweet man, and I kept up with him over the years. And he had an exquisite sense for language, and helped, I think, to remount some of the mannerisms that I may have still had in my prose, thanks to Deconstruction. And then I worked at the EPA briefly at the General Counsel's office, which is the office that makes sure that the regulations that the scientists have written allegedly conform with the congressional intent. I volunteered for the NRDC. I still consider myself an environmentalist. I didn't grasp, however, that the EPA does toxics regulation. And that was, so it was a lot of chemistry, and that was not really to my liking.
So do you consider yourself a classical conservative today or a classical liberal today?
I wouldn't I don't know. I guess, interesting, classical liberal. I suppose. I don't think I'm at all very libertarian. But I'm conservative to the extent, I suppose, that I do believe in self-discipline and restraint, in custom, in authority, and in meritocracy. I think that's probably the biggest, one of the biggest distinctions now. Meritocracy and the capacity of individuals to determine a good deal of their fate, which isn't to say that people are not born into wildly different circumstances. There's vast privilege. There's people who do not have privilege in their family circumstances. This is undeniable. But I still would argue today that the most important determinant of how people end up in life is the effort that they put in individually, and that any individual in America today has a massive scope for the exercise of individual agency.
How did you get into writing books?
Well, I got into writing where actually my first writing project was going to be, I wanted to write the definitive refutation of deconstruction, because I was so mad that I had wasted so much precious time when I could have been reading good books, reading this nonsense theory. So I'd collected all these file cards that I was going to show that none of this stuff mattered. Well, I never did that, but I did start writing on multiculturalism for places like Partisan Review, which alas no longer exists, and Salmagundi and Hudson Review, on the contemporary cultural politics, the multiculturalism that was hitting museums. You know, museums were saying we have to present everything through the lens of race and gender oppression, whether it's the Smithsonian or the Whitney Museum. So I started writing about that. And then I published something for City Journal, which is the Manhattan Institute's quarterly magazine. And the editor at the time, Myron Magnet, asked me to write something about an event that was happening in New York at the time. There was a crack addict, a mentally ill crack addict named Larry Hogue, who was terrorizing the Upper West Side of Manhattan because he would go berserk on crack, and he was mentally ill, and he would, you know, strike pedestrians, he would destroy windows, and then he would get picked up by the police and brought to a hospital, and he'd be treated and would calm down. And given the rules that make it so difficult to hold on to somebody who's mentally ill and a drug addict, he would be back on the streets the next day. So Myron Magnet asked me to write about this. I'd never written reporting before. I'd not done student journalism, something I regret. And all of you student journalists that are doing it, it's a good thing. It's a very good thing. So I did this with a certain amount of trepidation to actually do a reported piece. But after that, I kept doing that. And this was in the 1990s in New York. It was a very exciting time. It was during the mayoralty of Rudolph Giuliani, and it was an urban laboratory here. New York had become squalid. It had been the crime, you know, there was over 2,000 people who were murdered in 1990. And you had streets that were just chaos. The subways were chaotic, although they'd been helped by cleaning up the graffiti. But Giuliani was taking on an entrenched welfare bureaucracy that put out the notion that if you're poor, you cannot do anything for yourself, that we were the welfare capital of the world. 1 in 7 people in the United States who are on welfare lived in New York City. And Giuliani proposed a social contract that, okay, we're going to help you, but you have to also help yourself. So he was one of the centers doing welfare reform, of saying it's a reciprocal contract, you're going to have to work. And he also said for policing, he had a commissioner, his first commissioner, William Bratton, who did something that was so radical. He said, I'm going to lower crime. No police commissioner had said that. It was assumed up to that point that crime was a function ineluctably of poverty and racism, and that until we eradicated income inequality and racism, urban violence was a fact of nature that the police could only manage. They could try and get their response times down in getting to a robbery, in getting to that drive-by shooting, but they could certainly not avoid those things. And Bratton, he set himself a numerical target. He said, I am going to lower crime 10% my first year. No police chief had done that. In fact, the FBI's annual crime reports during the 80s would issue a annual disclaimer saying, we all know the police can't lower crime. Bratton not only met his target, he bested it. He brought in a 12% crime reduction. Next year, he upped the ante. He said, I'm bringing it down 15%. He met that and brought it down to crime 16%. So this was a transformative time, and it was a very exciting time to be doing journalism about urban policy.
And 2 of Heather McDonald's books are Cops Racist and The War on Cops. Was there the cost of bringing down that crime? Was there abuse of human rights? Was there abuse of police brutality?
No, we had police brutality. The shootings, what got me writing about policing for the first time, in 1999, there was a very tragic police shooting in New York, the shooting of Amadou Diallo, a West Ghanaian immigrant who was in the vestibule of his apartment in the Soundview section of the Bronx. And there'd been a crime pattern in the neighborhood, a series of rapes that the police were looking out for. And the cops saw him. They thought he matched a description. They asked him for ID. He didn't understand. He reached for his wallet. They thought he was reaching for a gun. Contagious gunfire started. One person shot. They thought the bullets were ricocheting back at them. They thought Diallo was returning fire. He was not. This was the infamous 41 shots. A heartbreaking, heartbreaking episode. Well, this was seized upon by the left, by Al Sharpton, by Susan Sarandon, by the media, who were furious at what Giuliani was doing in New York to take on the welfare industrial complex, to discredit the idea that you needed to, the only way to lower crime is by more government poverty programs. And they turned Diallo shooting into the very symbol of the NYPD. Well, that year in 1999, the NYPD, which at that point had a head count of somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 officers, shot fatally about 11 people. This was the lowest at the NYPD's history. In the 70s, they were killing 100 people a year at least. So as we were lowering crime, the use of police force was being driven down by the intensive use of data, by holding police commanders accountable. And the abuse of rights goes on with uncontrolled crime. The civil rights violation in our country that we should be worried about is the fact that blacks die of homicide at 6 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. That is a civil rights problem. It is a civil rights problem when the elderly cannot walk to the store without fear of a drive-by shooting. So Giuliani encouraged, and Bratton encouraged the police to intervene in suspicious behavior before it ripened into a felony, and they encouraged something called broken windows policing, which is attention to low-level forms of public disorder, which is the thing that when I go to inner-city neighborhoods and police community meetings, it's rare that people are there complaining about shooting or robbery patterns. What they're complaining about is the fact that they'll say, there's hundreds of kids hanging out on the corners fighting. What I've heard again and again is, whatever happened to the truancy laws? Why can't you get them off the corner? Or I smell weed in my hallway. Why can't you do something about it? The people that live in disorderly neighborhoods want public order, and the police started paying attention to that. I would say that's a civil rights triumph.
Heather McDonald is our guest on Book TV. This is our monthly in-depth program. One author, 3 hours, your calls. We're going to put the numbers up on the screen. We've talked for nearly an hour. Now it's your turn. 202 is the area code, 748-8200 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 202-748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. We're also going to scroll through our social media sites, so you can go ahead and comment that way too if you can't get through on the phone lines. Just remember, @BookTV is our handle. Heather McDonald is the author of these books, beginning with The Burden of Bad Ideas, How Modern Intellectuals Misshape Our Society. That came out in 2000. We haven't discussed that one yet. We'll get to it. Are Cops Racist? How the New Attack on Law and Order Makes Everyone Less Safe, 2003. The Immigration Solution, she's a co-author on that book, 2007. The War on Cops came out in 2016. Her most recent is The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. We've talked quite a bit about that. There's a lot more we could talk about with that. So a lot of topics on the table. Go ahead and dial in. We'll get to those calls in just a few minutes. You talked about, Heather McDonald, the welfare industrial complex. What about the prison industrial complex? Is there such a thing in your view? Prison overcrowding, profit motive to send people to prison?
No, I don't think if you're asking about the private prisons, they're not a major player on the horizon. And the argument has been made that some of these communities in upstate New York say that their workforce is exclusively prison, and so there's somehow this is determining what judges and prosecutors in New York do. I don't think so. You know, what's going on in the source of that prison population upstate is New York City. What's going on here is a desperate triage to handle the amount of crime that exists. Prison today remains a Lifetime Achievement Award for persistence in criminal offending. Any big city prosecutor is trying to keep people out of prison because there isn't enough space. Would it be great if we had a much lower prison population? Of course, but our prison population in the United States is a function of the fact that our violent crime rates are so much higher. Our murder rate is 7 times higher that of the average of the industrialized nations. And if you look at gun violence, our gun violence is about 22 times higher.
Why is that? Is it because of gun laws?
Well, traditionally we've been a violent culture, and I think the family breakdown is not helping things at all. You are not civilizing and socializing boys, and so there's a culture of violence in the streets now that is just terrifying if you live in those environments.
Are people receptive to that argument?
To which argument exactly?
The one you just made about the breakdown of the family?
Well, no, because when I bring this up on college campuses, there's 2 problems with that. When I say that on average, children need their mothers and fathers. On average. I mean, I'm not talking about any individual single-parent home. There are many heroic single mothers that are doing the best they possibly can to raise law-abiding children. And there are obviously tragedies where you have orphans and people who lose their parents. But for a variety of reasons, it is so complicated, Peter. The marriage culture itself, to the norm, the expectation that men and women will marry before they have children is itself a civilizing norm, leaving aside any individual child in his household. But if you talk about mothers and fathers being the best possible situation, and you know, President Obama, before he became president, he gave a Father's Day speech in Chicago in 2008 that laid out the data that has been available to social scientists for decades now about the fact that children growing up in single-parent homes have an average chance of getting involved in crime, ending up in prison, failing in school, juvenile delinquency, having emotional problems, being single mothers themselves. He went through the list. It's readily available. But if you say that, you're violating the strongest taboo is you're violating the taboo that strong women can do it all. We are now in a world where we see all masculinity as toxic. It is not a normal thing on a college campus to say that males bring something to civilization. Indeed, they are a driving force in civilization. And it also has become difficult to talk about mothers and fathers because it violates various gay taboos. So it is a message that is not welcome on college campuses by and large. But I mean, I've talked to people in prison who say the problem is that there's not enough fathers around. So this is a knowledge that is available in the very neighborhoods where it's most needed, but there needs to be a cultural transformation to bring it, give a more real-life instantiation.
From The War on Cops, Heather McDonald writes, some members of Chicago's left will argue against holding fathers or mothers responsible for their children. Quote, to blame it on the family is totally unfair, says Gwen Rice, a board member of the Developing Communities Project. I'm tired of blaming the parents. The services for the poor are paltry. It boggles the mind. Historically, you can't expect a parent who can't get a job to do something that someone with resources can do. These problems have histories. There are policies that have mitigated against black progress. What needs to happen is a change in corporate greed and insensitivity. Rice corrects my use of the term illegitimacy. Quote, there are no illegitimate births. A lot to break down in there.
Well, first of all, let me congratulate you. I'm in awe of your sticky pad management. That's quite extraordinary that you could get that quote. I couldn't have come up with that. I forgot that was even in there. Yes, that is a very crystalline summary, encapsulation of the left-wing view, which I think is extraordinarily destructive. It is telling people that they have no agency, that you cannot do anything, you cannot expect a lowering of crime, a less of involvement in drive-by shootings, in these youth crews that are going around shooting people, or you can't even get married or defer childbearing until there's more government spending. Now, we have been spending a lot of money. There's been trillions that have been spent on social programs since the 1960s. It is very, very difficult to say that there's been a lack of effort on that front. But there's something that has been talked about now. William Galston, an advisor to Bill Clinton, in the 90s talked about this, and it was true then, it's true now, something called the success sequence. You can avoid being poor by 3 simple activities. You finish high school, you wait until you're married to have children, and you work full-time at a job, any job. 75% of the people who do that are in the middle class. To tell people that young girls that they have no ability to defer child rearing, that that's somehow unfair, and to tell young males that they have no option but to serially impregnate girls, I think that is condescending, and I don't think many parents in the middle class would accept that for their children. They would expect their children to exercise self-restraint, to think prudentially, to think about the future, and to defer behaviors that, if engaged in as a teenager, are really kind of ending your life, and you're going to make it very difficult for yourself to advance.
I want to find out from you whether these stats hold up today or whether you know that or not. But this, in the chapter, again, back to the war on cops, is the criminal justice system racist, is the name of the chapter. In 2006, blacks were 37.5% of all state and federal prisoners, though they're under 13% of the national population. About 1 in 33 black men was in prison in 2006, compared with 1 in 205 white men, 1 in 79 Hispanic men. 11% of all black males between the ages of 20 and 34 are in prison or jail.
Well, the black share of the total prison population has gone down somewhat in the last couple of years, I would say over the last 5 years or so. But the disparities are still very large. And they come back, Peter, to the statistic that I mentioned before. Blacks die of homicide at 6 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. They're not being killed by whites, and they're not being killed by the cops. They're being killed by other blacks. The black homicide rate is 8 times that of whites and Hispanics combined. And if you take Hispanics out of that equation, you've got about an 11-to-1 black to white homicide rate. When you look at youth between the ages of 14 to 17, males, black males between the ages of 14 to 17 commit homicide at 10 times the rate of white and Hispanic males combined of those same ages. That is what's driving the disparities in our prison system. And it is not drugs. There's another stat in there. I'm going to test your sticky pad system here.
Let's go.
That shows you what happens when you remove all drug prisoners from the prison population of the United States.
Next,
God, it's incredible!
Critics blame drug enforcement for rising racial disparities in prison. Again, the facts say otherwise, Heather McDonald writes. In 2006, blacks were 37.5% of the 1.3 million state prisoners. If you remove drug prisoners from that population, the percentage of black prisoners drops to 37%, half a percentage point, hardly a significant difference.
Again, I'm just in awe. I'm in awe. You've got some sort of weird photographic memory going there, Peter. But yes, exactly. The point is that you can take all the drug prisoners out. It changes the proportions not a whit. The percentage of people in prison for possession of drugs is negligible. The population is driven by violent crimes and property crimes.
What's the Ferguson effect?
The Ferguson effect was the phrase I coined, picking up on a phrase that the St. Louis police chief had used that explained the dual phenomenon of police officers backing off of proactive policing in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement that told them that such policing was racist. And so police are political animals, as they should be. They got the message and they said, okay, we're going to drive by that guy that's hanging out on a known drug corner at 2 a.m. hitching up his waistband as if he has a gun. we're just going to wait for the next drive-by shooting to call in and not be proactive, we'll be reactive. And the flip side of that, the other half of the Ferguson effect, was the resulting increase in violence in inner city areas. 2015 and 2016 saw a 20% increase in the homicide rate in this country. Nearly 3,000 additional black males were killed over those 2 years compared to what the numbers were in 2014. And so it explained what was going on that was alarming to very many observers and certainly police chiefs and people living with the rising violence.
One of the things that I found interesting in the War on Cops was when you talked about black majority police forces and the effect on black policemen of this conversation or criticism that they get as cops.
Yeah, they get the same thing. They'll say, you know, if I stop a black driver, the first thing out of his mouth is, you only stopped me because I'm black. And I, black policeman, will say, no, I stopped you because you ran a red light. The vast majority of black cops, I mean, it is actually a very sort of reassuring and happy-making experience to go to a police precinct, because this is truly post-racial. The cops are all getting on. You know, there's a lot of camaraderie. And the black cops and the white cops, they all say, it's not a question of race, it's a question of behavior. If you're acting in such a way to raise my suspicions to the point where I have, say, legal authority, I always have a legal authority to go and ask you a few questions. You can walk away. The question is, when does that become the authority to do what's known as a custodial stop in constitutional policing parlance, a Terry stop, where you're not free to walk away. But I'm looking for behavior. I know crime patterns in this neighborhood. I know the kids that are hanging out, that are the gangbangers. That's what drives me. It's not race. Now, there are in some police departments sort of the radicals, but they are not representative.
Let's take some calls. Lots more topics to talk about with Heather McDonald, but let's start with Mike in Mahopac, New York. Thanks for holding, Mike. You're on Book TV.
Yeah, good afternoon. I retired from the NYPD last year at a 3-2 precinct in Central Harlem. But I also have a 4-year degree from Boston University in political science and international relations. And I'm just really sick of the massive ignorance of the public when it comes to basic facts and just the empirical data you can get from the Uniform Crime Report of the FBI, and the way the mainstream media cherry picks issues like stop, question, and frisk. Stop, question, and frisk is based on a U.S. Supreme Court decision from 1968, Terry v. Ohio, and it seems like the media has turned that that tactic into something that's illegitimate, when it's actually one of the most helpful things that ever happened for the city of New York in terms of driving crime down. And I just wish the public in general would just look a little deeper instead of just believing what they see in the media about race and crime, and especially in New York City.
So, Mike, you talked about stop and frisk. Isn't there a case to be made for racial profiling with that?
Well, absolutely not, because it's actually called stop, question, and frisk, and you cannot initiate a stop without reasonable suspicion. And it's like Ms. McDonald said, the reasonable suspicion is based on observed behavior. That's what people don't understand. You're not just randomly stopping people. You have to have reasonable suspicion to stop someone.
So you were in the precinct in Central Harlem, correct?
Yes.
What would you say the majority of your relations? What would you say were the majority of your relationships or interactions with the residents of that area?
Well, the overwhelming majority of people are just regular, hardworking citizens, and like Ms. McDonald said, they appreciated the enforcement efforts for the most part. They just want to live their lives and raise their kids like anyone else. It's just in that precinct is less than 1 square mile, and it's a very, very busy place to work, and there's a lot of guns, there's a lot of drugs, and that's just the reality of the situation. It's not.
Mike, are you
based on anyone's race.
are you white? Are you
Yes.
white, Mike?
Yes.
Were most of the people that you dealt with African American?
Well, I mean, that's the population, the majority population in the 3-2 precinct and the 2A precinct in Central Harlem is obviously black. I mean, less so than when I started in '97. But I mean, yeah, it's a mixed population, but the majority of it is black. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Heather McDonald, what'd you hear from Mike?
Well, he's absolutely right. It's the most bizarre thing. There was a trilogy of lawsuits that was brought during the Bloomberg years, the previous mayor in New York, before Mayor de Blasio, the one who followed Rudolph Giuliani, against the New York Police Department's stop, question, and frisk practice. These suits were brought by the elite law firms of the city, Paul Weiss, others, that were, these elite lawyers. They have doormen. They're living on Central Park West with doormen. And one of the lawsuits was targeting the police for enforcing criminal trespass laws in New York City housing. People that do not have private doormen on Central Park West, that are dependent on the police to try and get the drug dealers and the rapists out of their houses. The way the press, and they had a very sympathetic judge that issued rulings against the NYPD. The press characterized this as declaring that stop, question, frisk is unconstitutional. It's not, as Mike says. It's based on a 1965 Supreme Court case which addressed the issue. Is there some kind of intermediate authority that the police have between going up to somebody and asking a question? Again, if I as a police officer say, hey, Peter, can you give me your ID card? You don't have to comply. You can just walk away. You can say, F you, and walk away. Is there something that cops can do to try and investigate a situation that is short of making an arrest? When, if I arrest you, you're not free to walk away. You got to stick with me. And they came up with this intermediate, if a cop is observing behavior that looks like it's about to ripen into a crime or there's a crime in progress, they do have a right to go up to somebody, ask a few questions, possibly frisk if they feel there's a weapon there, and you can't walk away. That's known as a custodial stop. You're in custody. Stop, question, frisk is still legal. Terry stops are still legal. And I had a very liberal criminal law professor at Stanford Law School who himself has written that there is no more important police power for lowering shootings than stop, question, and frisk. But it's not just shootings. One of the things that the left always used was, well, the yield of guns that the NYPD got each year from stops was under 1,000. And therefore they said, well, this is all waste. It's doing nothing. Well, A, that doesn't take into account deterrence, that people are not carrying because of the possibility of stops. But it's not just getting guns off the street. It's also if there's been a pattern, say, of car thefts on the street, and cars are parked, and there've been thefts in a neighborhood, and the cop sees somebody who's going along trying car door handles, that can give rise to a Terry stop. And you can go up to somebody and say, excuse me, sir, what are you doing here? Can you explain yourself? So it is a very important police power. And the Ferguson effect, notice the fact that whether you talk about the pew polls of officers or talking to them personally, cops were saying across the country, we are not making those stops. It's too hostile. The environment that we're getting now on streets, thanks to the virulent anti-cop demagoguery that was being pushed out by the media during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and by politicians and by activists. When we get out of our cars now and ask a few questions, we are surrounded by people cursing at us. The cell phones go right in the face. It's an extremely loaded environment, and many cops are saying, okay, you know, you're telling us that Terry stops are racist, so we'll make less of them. And when the cops back off of proactive policing in high crime neighborhoods, crime goes up.
Should Mike, our white policeman who called in earlier, be assigned to the 2-8 or the 3-2 precinct in Central Harlem?
If he's a good cop, absolutely he should be. They deserve the best policing that anybody can get.
But isn't it important to have somebody who looks like you policing you?
No, I don't think so. Should I only have white cops? Can I not have a black policeman? I think that we have to fight back against this idea that we can only identify with people that have the same melanin content in their dermatological, you know, barrier between us and the real world. I just don't think so. And in fact, I mean, these are uncomfortable statistics. The Justice Department under President Obama and Eric Holder did a study of threat misperception in the Philadelphia Police Department. This is when cops, like the Diallo shooting, they mistake a cell phone for a gun. So they are misperceiving a threat. And the Obama Justice Department studied police shootings in Philadelphia and found that black cops were much more likely to shoot somebody based on threat misperception than white cops. So the idea that somehow you're going to get different shooting outcomes with black cops is wrong, and they may even be worse.
Next call for Heather McDonald is Jerry in Jean, Nevada. Hi, Jerry.
Hello, how are you today? I'm so happy to hear you speak with such eloquence and articulation on so many ideas that I have myself never felt I had the ability to express articulately like you do. I thank you so much.
Thank you.
But my real question was that I wondered if you've ever spoken with Amy Wax about the bourgeois values and their relationship to our society today.
Yes, I'm a friend of Amy, and I write about it in the Diversity Delusion.
University of Pennsylvania?
Yes, she's a University of Pennsylvania law professor who had the temerity in the summer of 17 now, I guess, to publish an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer that said that a lot of our social problems, our urban problems, are due to a breakdown of bourgeois values, the values that were more in the ascendancy in the 1950s, things like respect for authority, temperance, sobriety, marriage, waiting till you're married to have children, and this was viewed as an extraordinary violation of the political orthodoxy on college campuses. There was a huge amount of protest against her, and she stood her ground. She is tough as nails, and the dean of her law school wrote a very mealy-mouthed thing, as they always do. They say, okay, well, of course we believe in free speech, but the values of Amy Wax do not necessarily reflect those of Penn Law. She then got into further trouble by a video interview she did with the Brown University economist Glenn Lowry, where they talked about racial preferences and something that I write about called mismatch theory, and the fact that you are actually not doing the alleged beneficiary of a racial preference any favor by bringing him into an academic environment for which he's not prepared to compete. And this is not related to race, it's related to preference. If it was a gender preference and you're admitting me to MIT with low math SATs, and I'm not going to be able to compete. So Amy Wax, during this blogging head's interview noticed the fact that the black law students at UPenn clustered at the bottom of their class. And this is true in every law school in the country, because every law school is employing very large racial preferences. It is putting those students at a competitive disadvantage. She said this was again viewed as an even worse enormity, as an even worse, to use the safety rhetoric, Peter, it is putting the black students at risk. She has now been banned from teaching first-year law classes because she is viewed as so toxic.
And Amy Wax, by the way, did an interview on C-SPAN. If you go to cspan.org or booktv.org, type in her name, you'll see it. You'll see the interview. It's an hour-long interview that she did. In the Diversity Delusion, Heather McDonald, you also take on California's, if you're in the top 10% of your class or 9% of your class, free education in the UCal system, in the UC system. Sounds like a pretty good deal.
Well, the issue there is that this was one of their many ways to try and get around Proposition 209, which was a voter referendum in 1996 led by the brilliant, courageous Ward Connerly to try and bring California into line with our Constitution, or what used to be our belief in treating people as individuals rather than the basis of race and gender. So Prop 209, passed by voters to change the California Constitution, said government agencies may not discriminate on the basis of race and gender, which means they may not use racial preferences, meaning you have to admit students on a colorblind basis on the basis of their academic credentials. The University of California went into fits. How dare you tell us that we cannot use racial preferences? How will we create the leaders of the future? The snobbery that is involved in the defense of racial preferences is completely amazing. These UC chancellors, the chancellor of UC Berkeley said, well, if we can't use racial preferences to admit our critical mass of black students, where will the black leaders of the future come from? As if somebody who goes instead of UC Berkeley, who goes instead of the University of California at Riverside, as if his life is over. Well, then why don't we just shut down UC Riverside so everybody can go to UC Berkeley, if it is so crippling to one's life chances? So UC has come up with, it's been twisting itself into knots for decades to try and come up with surrogates for overt racial preferences, because it is so determined to, as the quotes from Hillary Clinton in the beginning of the show, racial diversity defined on the basis of race, which means today, keep out the Asians, because they're whooping everybody's ass because they study so hard. So we got to keep out the Asians and make place for people who are not competitive. So one of the things they came up with, in addition to holistic admissions, which is, well, you get bonus points if you can say you're a really good victim, is you admit people based on their class standing in any given class. And this is hoped that it would bring in more blacks. But again, not all GPAs are equal. You know, if you're graduating the top of your class from some of these inner city schools where people are not doing their homework, you know, you get an A just for taking your textbook home and not being truant, that's not going to prepare you. You need an objective test that everybody is held to the same measure. And I talk about a boy in the book who was admitted to UC Berkeley under this program that gets there, and his freshman year is just a nightmare because he's not prepared. It's heartbreaking. Psychologically, it's devastating. And he keeps trying to rally his spirits. Come on, Kashan, you can do it. You know, we can compete now. But it's very hard to keep up. So the idea of getting rid of objective testing, the irony, of course, is the SAT was created, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, was created in the 1940s and 50s to get rid of class prejudice. It was in order to allow those kids in the Midwest who had not gone to Andover or Exeter, who were not the elite New England prep school aristocracy, to show their academic ability and be able to compete for Yale and Harvard. And now we're saying that it's elitist to use it when it's colorblind. The further irony is, these people that are so committed to the narrative of ubiquitous racism, if they really believe that colleges are infected by institutional racism and that nobody is capable of judging people on the basis of merit, they should want objective tests. They're completely contradictory in their views because they are against objective tests now. They want to give discretion to these admissions officers so that they can use race illegally in many instances in California, in Washington State, in Michigan, so that they can use race. So in fact, they really don't believe in institutional racism because they are confident that if we give discretion to college admissions officers to use race, they're going to use it in favor of blacks and Hispanics, not in favor of whites, and that contradicts the racism narrative.
A tweet from Peggy. I would like to ask Heather Mac Donald why she speaks with such disdain and venom about American students on campus. I have watched one of her talks and truly cannot understand her anger.
Because for any student to think of himself as a victim when he has at his fingertips the greatest privilege that has ever been granted an individual, the thing that Faust sold his soul for, which is knowledge, that student is in the grip of a terrible delusion and is failing to take advantage of opportunities that, again, students the world over would kill for. Students that are there to learn, that appreciate what they have, that are spending time in the libraries, that realize that they have been given an inheritance that is precious. Those students I respect. I cannot respect students who go around playing the victim card when to be a college student today is to be privileged.
Gina, Princeton, New Jersey.
To challenge Heather's terrible attitude toward multiculturalism. I am a mixed race lady. I'm very proud of that fact. I'm a retired educator, and I know for a fact that we have good students. I've had good students of all stripes. What I would wish that she would do is write a different book. I think you have your handle on some of the problems we face as a society, but I think you're missing the boat. We need everybody to work. And I think you should write about encouraging, not from a venomous point of view, but from a motivational point of view, encouraging students to learn as much as they can, to fly as far as they can. We need everybody to help solve the problems that we're facing. Maybe another book, or maybe someone else could write a book. We need something to bring people together to solve the problem.
Gina,
and I don't you doing that.
Gina, what did Heather Mac Donald say that you disagree with specifically? Is there something?
Her attitude. I think her attitude toward
her attitude,
her base bashing the left. She's not advocating unity. I think we need to come together. Her title of the book, The Diversity Delusion, how off-putting. That's more divisive than trying to bring us together. I think I'm serious, Heather. I think that you see some of the problems and some of the things that you've said, okay, there's some truth here and there. But I think by trying to divide people and put people off by this attitude that diversity is not a joy, that it's some burden. Diversity should be a joy. It should be a gift.
All right,
I'll just
Gina, thanks. Okay, go ahead.
I had a wonderful talk that I saw with Dr. Wood on founding era politics and music. And I will just leave you with a few words that she said, that the founders of our country knew they needed to find harmony in its diversity. So if you'll be so kind, I'll leave you with that.
All right, thank you, Gina from Princeton, New Jersey. Go ahead.
Well, the idea that the diversity ideology, as it's presently constituted, is a source of unity as opposed to division is preposterous. From the moment a student steps on campus today, he is brainwashed into an ideology of toxic masculinity, white privilege, white oppression, white supremacy, that females are victims. This is not a uniting rhetoric. This is a rhetoric that divides people on the basis of race and gender, that tells them that the most important thing about them is their race and gender. I know conservative whites and liberal blacks. I know liberal whites and conservative blacks. I am not going to assume anything about you on the basis of your skin color or what's between your legs. But the diversity rhetoric, and we now see it in the real world. I mean, we are all in Gender Studies 101 now, Peter. This thing is not staying put. It has jumped the wall. It is transforming American society. The hysteria about Brett Kavanaugh was a direct import, the Believe Survivors mantra, that females who claim to be the victim of sexual assault are entitled, prima facie, end of story, to unquestioning credulity. That's a direct import from the campus rape ideology, that it is a frontal assault on one of the greatest discoveries of Anglo-American jurisprudence, which is the presumption of innocence, something that did not govern jurisprudence during the Middle Ages. It is a frontal assault on due process, the hysteria over the Covington, Kentucky children that saw them, the entire elite let out one glad cry that finally they had come up with a living embodiment of white supremacy privilege, the type of hatred that was directed at those kids who were themselves trying to diffuse a situation of these black Israelites that were spewing out anti-Indian, anti-gay, anti-female, anti-white hate speech. They were trying to come between. That's the world we're living in now today, thanks to the diversity ideology. It is about group identity. It is not about individuals.
But our friend Gina in Princeton said we should all come together, multiculturalism. Do you have anything against multiculturalism?
No, I think all cultures have something to provide. We should read the best of all cultures. If we had world enough in time, college should maybe go on for 20 years, and we would be as equally well versed in the culture of China or India as we are in the United States and Europe. The fact of the matter is we are in the West. Our primary obligation is to pass on that inheritance. But obviously, cultures, there's expression of sublimity that humans have been able to reach across cultures. But that's not, the rhetoric sounds good unless you know what the words that come next.
Heather McDonald, writing in the City Journal from the Manhattan Institute. Jussie Smollett made a not irrational wager that a patently preposterous narrative about an anti-black, anti-gay hate crime at 2 a.m. in sub-zero Chicago would be embraced by virtually the entirety of the mainstream media, leading Democratic politicians, Hollywood, and academia with no one in these cohorts bothering to fact-check his narrative or entertain even armchair skepticism toward it.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, it's the follow-up from Covington, Kentucky, which I would say was also a hoax. The elites in this country are desperate to put flesh on the narrative of ubiquitous white supremacy. And so it's become almost a hysteria in this country of institution after institution, whether it's law firms that say, yes, we're racist, we're racist, we're racist, at the same time that it is, again, demonstrably provable that they are doing as much as they can to try and recruit, hire, and promote both people of color and females. But it has become a sort of odd search for racism and the joy that has greeted any alleged discovery of it.
If you can't get through on the phone lines, reminder, on all our social media sites, @BookTV is our handle. We'll scroll through those on the bottom of the screen. George in Hudson, Florida, thanks for holding. You're on with author Heather McDonald.
Good afternoon. Nice talking to you, Mr. McDonald. You know, I like in-depth. It gives me the opportunity to see the personality behind these publications. And I'm quite honestly, I like what I'm hearing from you, and I like your take no prisoners attitude. I think it's great. Now, I'm a staunch conservative. I'm going to ask you a question. I might not like the answer to it. But how do you think President Trump is doing has done and is doing now in the last 2 years of his presidency?
Well, I like his policies. I cannot stand his what he's doing to the national character. I think he is setting the worst possible role model for young males in his vindictiveness, his thin skin. I support his policies 100%. I support his immigration policies. I was sickened by his treatment of Attorney General Jeff Sessions. It was a classic Trump gambit to have a scapegoat for problems of his own creation. Sessions was the most important member of his cabinet for realizing Trump's promises on immigration, on violent crime, and yet Trump consistently treated him with the most just disgusting mean-spiritedness. And I've recently written against his declaration of a national emergency. Now, again, let me be perfectly clear. I think that the mass unskilled immigration is a crisis. I think it is a national emergency, and I support a wall. But I think his declaration of a national emergency is a constitutional violation, something that is far more important, because he has now decided that the Congress, which controls the power of the purse, which has the constitutional authority to appropriate funds, they were not willing to appropriate the funding that he wanted for the wall. It ends there. They don't see it as a national emergency. That's a political question. Trump has got to do a better job of convincing people that it is. For him now to say, okay, I'm going to act as Congress and raise my own money, when they've explicitly turned me down, is to set aside the Constitution and put us at risk. And if I'm waiting for the moment when we get our next Democratic president who decides that the Republicans are not giving him or her enough funding to fight climate change, and that president says, well, it's a national emergency, I'm going to appropriate $100 billion to put cars out of existence and airplanes. And the first thing the Republicans will say is, you are violating your authority as president. We are setting a precedent that is dangerous. So Trump is far too casual and cavalier, as far as I'm concerned, both with the norms of public behavior, of magnanimity, and of the constitutional norms. That having been said, again, I support his policies. I don't think he's a racist. I don't think he's a sexist. I just think he's a self-engrossed, thin-skinned a person who is not something we should aspire our males to emulate.
You also write about President Trump in the City Journal. President Trump maligned the criminal justice system in his State of the Union speech. The claim that the criminal justice system is racist is the mantra of left-wing activists the country over. Adopting it for the State of the Union was an unfortunate attempt to score bipartisan political points.
Peter, again, you amaze me. Just, how do you sleep? Yes, exactly. He wasted his last moments of the Republican-controlled Congress when he could have been doing something on the wall with this First Step Act, which I'm actually kind of agnostic about. I can live with the First Step Act. It lowers sentences for certain federal drug crimes and violence crimes. I can live with that because the fact of the matter is that all sentences are arbitrary. And if they'd been lower to begin with, if they'd been 2 years lower to begin with, nobody would be complaining. It's just politically, it's hard to ratchet sentence down. It's easier to ratchet them up. That having been said, though, I think it was a waste of political capital, and the narrative that he used in signing this law gives succor to the destructive narrative about criminal justice racism, which is completely false. You know, the criminologists have been trying to show this for decades, and the honest ones like Robert Sampson, Michael Tonry, have been forced to conclude against their inclinations that the overrepresentation of blacks in prison is due to criminal offending, not to criminal justice racism.
Here's an email. This is from Gretchen. Would you not agree that whiteness in America is an identity itself, which has been the dominant norm setter for our society? When those who are not white assert their significance, it is called identity politics. Is there no legitimacy to this assertion against the norm?
I don't think you need identity politics to assert your legitimacy. I think you need individualism. You need a sense of living up to the founding documents of this country, of treating all people equally, recognizing their individual worth. Identity politics is group politics. That is something inimical to individual worth. You know what, Peter? Being female is not an accomplishment. It is not a particularly interesting thing to be. And I know it is probably the case that I have been put on panels, invited to do things because I'm a female. That's insulting. Maybe that's the best I've got to offer. It could well be, you know, that I've nothing besides my sex. But if that is the case, I'd rather not be on those panels. I'd rather be chosen because of my ideas. And now we have this crusade against manels. Do you know what a manel is?
No.
Oh, well, you haven't spent enough time in universities. A manel is any panel of experts that is all male. Oh my God, heaven forbid an all-male panel. So fanels are fine. If you're a fanalist, it's really great. The University of San Diego recently announced a biology conference that they'd only invited females to. So it was going to be all fanels. That's fine. But if you are putting together a panel of people to talk about the latest cancer research, and it just so happens that the people doing the cutting-edge work in that particular area are males. If you're going to obey the reigning orthodoxy on college campuses today, you have to throw that mantle out and bring some females in. You know what? I do not care Who solves cancer? What I care, are they the best scientists? So identity politics is not about, it's not about unity, and it's not about individual worth. It is inevitably, if you look at it as it plays out in the world today, it is about conflict and opposition and a sense of grievance.
Let's hear from Paul in Sun City West. I believe that's Arizona. Hi, Paul.
Yes, it is. Hello. Thank you very much for taking my call. Ms. McDonald, very insightful, and I thank Book TV so much for providing things like this. You said a little earlier in general that you feel people have the ability to make choices, and that's the, you know, and there are challenges in life, whatever it is, I'm taking that you mean that people can make choices and make better of their life. We live in a gold medal, egocentric free market world that has given us great value that we're blessed with and I appreciate so much. But I believe there's a delicate balance between choice and compassion, you know, and the ability to instill work ethic, emotional stability, recognize different abilities in our education system that needs to not just throw a word of choices that people can get out of what they're in. You know, I guess I'll just kind of stop right there. I'm just recently retired. You can probably tell by the city I'm in, and I'm kind of just starting my retirement with a dedication to helping kids find their place. And I feel like.
And Paul, you're retired from what?
The corporate world, which I feel has been very abusive, and the weight of our economy is so slanted towards free market without a conscience. I worked in finance for several years. After I'll just stop there.
All right. Thank you, sir. Heather McDonald.
Well, you know, this is certainly a debate right now about the free market. Tucker Carlson famously or infamously started this off by a monologue in his show that said, you know, Republicans and conservatives have this knee-jerk worship of the free market, but community matters, other things matter. And I would agree with that. So when I talk about choice, I don't know if you're hearing that as sort of a libertarian, the only thing that matters is, say, consumer choice. I would say absolutely tradition matters, custom matters, authority matters, constraints on the ego of will matters, and an awareness of the need to follow certain civilizational norms. But I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know if agency would ring more positively to your ears, but I just think it's not a good thing to be routinely sending the message to certain groups of children in our society that because of their race, they are going to face unending obstacles and animosity. Because again, there is a lot that any individual can do to advance himself. Again, paying attention in school, you know, taking your school books home, doing your homework, being respectful towards your teacher. There's a piece that was published in Quillette last month called Public Education's Dirty Secret. And it was by a public school teacher in New York, now retired. And she describes a reality in New York public school that is not allowed to be talked about in public discourse, of the degree of chaos in the classroom, of kids that are violent, assaulting their teachers, cursing, the stigma against studying because that's seen as acting white, the stigma against using certain vocabulary because those are white words. All of these things. Now, it's up to the authorities, it's up to the teachers and principals to discipline kids and be able to set norms. We've got this absolutely poisonous idea now that discipline rates should be set based on race, and that any school disciplinary practice that has a disparate impact on minorities must be jettisoned. And disruptive students must be kept in the class to destroy the learning of other students. That's very bad. School authorities have to be willing to maintain order, but it's up to parents as well to expect their children in school to respect teachers and to put in an effort to learn. And I would emphasize that is within every child's ability.
Why Johnny's Teacher Can't Teach is the crusade against racism. It's just the latest irrelevancy to seize the nation's teacher education schools. For over 80 years, teacher education in America has been in the grip of an immutable dogma responsible for endless educational nonsense. That dogma may be summed up in the phrase, anything but knowledge. Schools are about many things, teacher educators say, depending on the decade: self-actualization, following one's joy, social adjustment, or multicultural sensitivity. But the one thing they are not about is knowledge.
That's true. Absolutely. I spent time at Columbia College, Teachers College, Bank Street. The one thing you do not hear talked about in those ed schools is how can we cram as much knowledge into students' empty noggins as possible. They come in ignorant to schools, and by and large, they leave ignorant, because now it's all about, again, it's about community building or identity politics. And the idea that the scourge of progressive education, which is that students are supposed to teach themselves. Teachers cannot be top-down authorities, intellectual authorities. Students are supposed to construct their own knowledge. Poll after poll has shown that American students' knowledge of the basics of American history, what century did the Civil War occur in, what century did World War II in, it just gets worse and worse by the decade. And part of it is all these excuses for not just saying, you will learn. You got to sit down, you got to memorize. Sorry, you got to memorize. You know, it's just not about constructing knowledge and having group projects. You got to put in the hard work. We're becoming more and more ignorant of our history, of the rest of the world, because the idea of knowledge itself is somehow seen as oppressive, that it too is like, it's white. And therefore we have to, you know, in mathematics, I mean, this has been a discourse for decades now, that mathematics is somehow a white thing. Now it's also heteronormative. Objectivity is seen as white. Objectivity is seen as oppressive. If we should shut down every ed school in the country and test only for, do you know American history? Do you know algebra? Do you know French? And can you convey it? But the ed schools have been really a very, very bad source of our national scandal of widespread ignorance.
Email, Chuck. Who would you most like to debate about any of the topics you've been discussing, not because they're a bomb thrower, but because they make the most sense?
Interesting.
You want to think about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Wayne in San Diego. Hi, Wayne.
Hello. I have about 40 words and 4 points that I would like this lady to comment on. I wonder why we don't actually teach honest intellectual engagement in the schools. I would refer her to an article, Politics 3, in the Stanford Research Institute by A.H. Maslov of many years ago for details on this. My great mentor, Raymond Gilmore, once said, the suspension of judgment is the highest exercise in intellectual discipline. I would like her to comment on that. As you can see, they're related. The suspension of intellectual discipline is jumping to conclusions based on egocentric obsession. I would like her to discuss that. And to discuss stopping the left-right dichotomy as opposed to ideology. And should threats be legal? Illegal. I'm sorry.
Wayne,
and,
what do you do? Wayne, what do you do for a living? What do you do for a living, Wayne?
I'm retired. I started out as a farm boy and ended up in ecosystem restoration, and I had the good fortune to encounter many interesting people along my life. I'm 80 years old right now, and so I appreciate your program very much, and I wish there was some way that I could contact this lady by email and extend the discussion, but unfortunately that's not the real world.
All right, well, let's see what Heather McDonald wants to say to what you were saying, and whether or not you want to give a website or a email address. That's up to you.
Well, they can certainly contact the Manhattan Institute. I don't remember the exact phrase you used, Wayne, but I'm going to analogize it to a phrase that is au courant these days in education circles, which is critical thinking, which that's what ed schools now, if they talk about things, or college presidents, critical thinking is what we need to teach, which is structure rather than content. And I'm not a favor of that either. I think you learn critical thinking by grappling with actual content material. Certainly, it is an ideal, the ideal of disinterestedness, of being able to subject your own beliefs to doubt, as Descartes tried to do, is a great intellectual accomplishment. We all have blinders, and we select the information that verifies our worldview and tend to discount that which doesn't, and I'm sure that I'm guilty of that myself. But I would just say that we're in such a crisis right now as far as the looming ignorance, that I think the fanatical, univocal focus of education should be on content that you test. Do you know the facts of biology? Do you know the periodic table? Have you read the Greek tragedians? Have you experienced the Oresteia? Have you experienced Shakespeare? Have you experienced pastoral poetry? And do you know anything about how unique it was to develop the concept of constitutional government and neutral principles that would restrain the human drive for power and oppression? So I don't know that we know how to teach those other things that are at a more meta level. If you can get the content across, that is accomplishment enough.
Daniel, Faribault, Minnesota. Hi, Daniel.
Hi. Yeah, I have ADHD, but I believe everybody in New York City is ADHD. If you take him and put him on a farm after 6 months, he's normal. But if you put me on a farm after 6 months, the farm will be hopping. So anyways, to start out, my dad was a Green Beret. He was one of the elite of elite. And I lived on a small farm, Blue Minnesota, richest land in the world. But I'm Native American, but I'm Native, I don't know, and where it goes is because I purchased some property that's a ancestral 150-year-old farm, and that person's family, I'm the second owner, but it was through a state forfeiture. But how do you go about the nativeness of not knowing who you are, but knowing who you are by not being told who you are through our culture?
Daniel, we're gonna cut it off right there. There's a lot of philosophical thought going in there. Have you thought about the debate question? Have you had a chance to think, or should we save that for the end of the show?
A debate question.
Let's save it for the end of the show. I don't want to catch you unawares. Heather McDonald is a co-author of a book from 2007 called The Immigration Solution. We want to show you just a portion as we, and then we'll add the immigration issue to our discussion here today. We've got about an hour left in our program with Ms. McDonald. To border policy. What is the solution? Is it a wall? Does a wall really make a difference?
Well, it's one part of it, I think.
Is it immoral?
No. I mean, why does Israel get a wall and we don't? I think if the sending countries are not willing to try and stop that, if they're not able to get their own acts together, the country has borders. That is part of what creates national sovereignty, what creates a nation. It's not all just one world government yet. So that is part of the solution, but I think other things are E-Verify, that employers should be mandated to make sure that their workers are here legally. It's a very simple process to check electronically. It's instantaneous. But I think as well, we have these magnets of things like sanctuary cities and a constant effort on the part of certain Democratic politicians to try to normalize illegal status and give as many benefits as possible. And that clearly serves as a magnet. I would also ideally get rid of birthright citizenship. I don't think that it is not written in the Constitution. It's a constitutional Supreme Court decision that gives rise to the idea of birthright citizenship. But it was, the 14th Amendment was clearly intended to give rights to American slaves and blacks. Nobody was thinking when they passed the 14th Amendment that they would be saying that somebody who crosses pregnant the Mexican border in order to have a baby here so that that person can be an American citizen. That was light years from what they were contemplating.
But what about for people such as yourself, born in California? Is that a birthright that you're born as an American citizen?
Yes, because my parents were here. They're citizens. They're legal. That's, again, what a nation is. It's a compact between individuals. Of course, these things are arbitrary, but the alternative is to have no sense of national identity, no cultural continuity, and to have people living outside of a country deciding what basically the laws are of that country, what the immigration policy should be, what its demographics should be. And I think that is a right that resides in the people of a country itself.
202 is the area code if you want to participate in our conversation with Heather McDonald here on Book TV. 748-8200 for those of you in the East and Central time zones. 202-748-8201 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Also, we have all our ways of contacting us via social media. We'll scroll through those as we continue our conversation. Sam in Stanwood, Washington, you have been very patient. Thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Hi. Am I on?
Stan, please go ahead. We are listening.
Yes, I would like to comment on her response. I would like to say to Heather McDonald, first and foremost, I appreciate every single word you have written. It is based in facts and truth. And I want your take on Mr. Hussein Obama and when he gave the authority and the go-ahead on murdering cops because black students were angered, it was okay to murder police via our president. I wonder what your take on that is. Secondly, I'd like another answer on your take of the false narrative that everybody in America is racist. Van Jones said the night of the election that America is the most racist country in the world because we did not invoke Hillary Clinton into the magistrate, the God, the majesty, whatever it was. And tell me one more. How do you feel about the whole federal government involved in a coup? We have now become a third world country because of a coup that has never been attempted in American history. But
hey,
for
tell you what,
Hussein,
Sam, we're going to stick with that, particularly that first question that you brought up, because President Obama is quoted and critiqued quite often in Heather McDonald's The War on Cops.
Well, I don't think he ever said that it's okay to kill cops. I mean, they didn't come anywhere close to that. Nevertheless, I do fault President Obama for giving power, giving authority to the Black Lives Matter narrative that said that we are living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black men, for implying that the reason that blacks are disproportionately in prison is because of their race rather than their actions. And I also fault him for the fact that after 5 cops were murdered in Dallas in July of 2017, he went to the memorial service for those 5 cops and repeated this lie that the criminal justice system is racist. This was not the moment to do that. So finding causal connections is always difficult, but I would say that the assassinations of cops that we've been seeing for the last couple of years, some part of those have been inspired in some way by the just extraordinary hatred that has become the daily experience of all too many cops now working in inner city areas.
November 24th, 2014, Heather McDonald writes, President Obama betrayed the nation, even as he went on national television to respond to the grand jury decision not to indict Officer Darren Wilson for fatally shooting Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The looting and arson that had followed Brown's shooting were being reprised, destroying businesses and livelihoods over the next several hours. Obama had one job and one job only in his address that day: to defend the workings of the criminal justice system and the rule of law.
Yeah. And instead, again, like after the assassination of the Dallas officers, he chose to bring up the idea that cops are shooting black men disproportionately based on their race, which again is not the case. And this narrative puts us all at risk because we are undercutting the legitimacy of law and order. And that's playing with fire. The nation has largely been free of the tribal violence that still characterizes many other parts of the world today. It is something that I think is built into human beings, that kind of group us versus them that can lead to violence. But the rhetoric that the elite institutions, the mainstream institutions use against the criminal justice system, and the idea, you quote Van Jones, that there's no more racist country on earth, that is just preposterous. It is preposterous. You go to many China, African countries, homophobia, my God, the misogyny, the rest of the world is coming to the United States. The reality of the 21st century is the migration of third world country residents into the West. Are they trying to get in because they're going to the most racist spots on earth? I don't think so. I think they are going to places that have offered the best opportunity to all people, including so-called people of color, of any place else on earth. The patterns of migration speak for themselves.
Crane is in Folsom, Louisiana. Hi, Crane.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Heather. I'm going to be real brief and very direct about this. I'm a retired police officer from southeast Louisiana. You know, it's real simple, and this is not being political, but I will say this. I spent 20 years doing the job, and every single police officer, and I came in after the Rodney King affair, you know, happened in the 90s, and I will tell you this, after my academy training, we were very sensitized to not only race relations, but neighborhood relations between police officers and the department. And I have found every single officer I have ever worked with simply puts their head down, does their job, and it's very thankless. And another thing, in terms of justification, when somebody has to shoot, which is a last resort in our job, it states in our, at least as far as Louisiana goes, that what you have to say is, and that not only goes for police officers, but for civilians, is that you are in fear of death or great bodily harm. We hear on the news repeatedly that the person that was shot was unarmed. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with what I just said. And I will say this, that I am very proud. I've never had to fire my weapon in 20 years, and I'm retired now. But I will say this, all of our police officers are just simply trying to do their job and do it as best they can. Thank you, Heather, for your job.
And Crane, we're going to get an answer from Heather McDonald in just a minute, but I wanted to ask you about the Second Amendment as a police officer.
Okay, in terms of carrying firearms?
Yes, sir. Well,
here in Louisiana, you can carry a firearm open carry, as long as it's shown. You can carry it. You can carry it in your vehicle any way you want. And so the restrictions on the Second Amendment here in Louisiana are very, very, you can kind of do as you please, as long as if you're going to carry open carry, you have to show it. We do have concealed carry in which you have to, go through the training, and then you have to go through all number of issues to make sure that you're, knowledgeable in the use of your firearm if you're going to carry it concealed. And that's how it works here in Louisiana.
But what is your view about that as a police officer? Yeah. And if you pulled a car over, do you presume that that person driving is carrying?
Well, yes. We always, when we pull a vehicle over, we will assume that, and it depends. Now, if I'm pulling a car over because it matches a description of a vehicle that is wanted for or is known for having committed a felony, or the person in the car, then we will do what we call a felony takedown. And then there are certain restrictions that we go through to make sure that we may have multiple officers on the scene and make sure that we, safely detain the vehicle and the person, the operator of the vehicle, and then, decide whether or not that person is, wanted for the, a crime that the vehicle may match in terms of the crime that was called in.
But that's an interesting question, because I've noticed that there tends to be a division between big city chiefs and officers about people carrying. But, this was one of the problems after the assassinations of the cops in Dallas, where the first news reporting was that there were like 20 different assassins, because there were so many people walking around with guns. I would think that if you're an officer, and I know some that do feel this way, you do want the monopoly on the use of force. You know, you don't want everybody walking around armed to the teeth, because it becomes more, I would think it would make the job more complicated to try to distinguish the good guys with guns from the bad guys with guns. But I have to say, I have met quite a few cops that are very avid Second Amendment fans and are perfectly okay working in an environment where people have guns.
Yeah, I'm not sure where Crane came down. I tried to ask him in 2 different ways, and
yeah.
we never quite got a yes, people should carry or not carry.
Right.
So, Hugh is in. Before we go to Hugh and Ashland, do you speak to police groups? That's a 2nd or 3rd officer that's called in today.
Yes, I've spoken, I've given talks at the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the FBI's organization and others, yes.
Hugh in Ashland, Virginia. Hi, Hugh.
Hi, I was going to come from a whole different perspective related to unity, but I'd like to stay on the topic of police. I was a contract security officer for many years and worked at all different levels. My life was actually saved by the police in New York due to a near-death experience related to COPD that totally disabled me. I relocated from New York down to Virginia and was arrested from my bed. I've never been arrested from anything in my life by a corrupt police sergeant who's now dead. Now, I do have a big website. I actually share common background with President Trump. I'd love to share 3 words that Heather can look over this whole website and may follow up with me, because the whole situation related to my arrest is being covered up, and that goes back into the President Obama administration. There's even a letter from a police chief that said there was a hearing, which there never was, and I was found not guilty.
Hey, Hugh, before we get into what this is, why don't you give us the website so we can all look at it?
Yes, just to Google 3 words. This isn't the website, but it'll bring you to a page on the website. My last name, Traulsen, is spelled T like Tom, R-A-U-L-S-E-N like Nancy, then put the word and, A-N-D, and then Trump, T-R-U-M-P.
All right. Traulsen and Trump, we appreciate that. I apologize. I just want to get to some more calls before we run out of time. Next up for Heather McDonald is Jeff in Big Timber, Montana. Jeff, thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Well, thank you. Miss McDonald, I admire your writing, and it doesn't really much matter if you're a woman, a man, or gay, or black, or white, or a Martian. I just admire what you have written. I'm the editor of a weekly newspaper in Montana, and I did email you, some weeks ago to ask permission to run a column that appeared in the Los Angeles Times, excerpt from your book, Diversity Delusion. I'm thankful you've worked so hard to expose this absurd runaway obsession, particularly on the campuses. 50 years ago, this is not all that new. 50 years ago, I was a student at the University of Oregon, and one of the sociology professors thought Joseph Stalin was a pretty swell guy. And I just walked out. I couldn't believe it. But I just really have one main question for you. This current culture on the campuses could be comedic if it isn't so damaging. It's steering the young minds in the guise of creating diversity. So how can we rid our campuses of this pervasive virus? I wrote a column, just one other thing. I wrote a column saying a letter to our freshmen, and I urged them, our local students going to college, to keep in mind genuine free speech and to steer clear of radicals on both sides of the spectrum. So there's a lot more I could talk about, but I'd just like to hear you now.
Jeff, did you get permission to run Heather McDonald's column in your paper?
I hope so. I hope I ran in Montana. You certainly deserved it.
I certainly did.
Okay, all right. I was going to say, we'll get it for you right now if you need it. All right, Jeff in Big Timber, Montana.
I give you future permission. You can run anything I write, and I'd be honored to be in your paper. Thank you so much. Well, one thing that's got to happen is alumni, you got to do your due diligence, and you got to cut off the money spigot. Do not give money to your alma mater if you're a college graduate unless you are absolutely confident that they have separated themselves from this poisonous victim identity politics. You know, money will talk, even though these colleges are fabulously wealthy. Princeton has an endowment of about $1 million per current student. They still need, they hate capitalism, but they still want more money. So if alumni were to, as a unified matter, stop giving money, I think that would get their attention. Otherwise, it's very tough. I do not believe in preferences for conservatives. It is just the case, and liberals have been documenting this, that the ideological skew of the professoriate gets more and more extreme by the decade. In theory, I don't think that matters. You know, I actually don't know what the politics were of my college professors. I don't care. They might have all been Democrats. It didn't really matter because, fortunately, by and large, at that point, I may have been blind to it, but I don't think there was any politics in my classroom besides this weird deconstructive stuff, which did have ultimately a anti-Western view if you dig down enough. But I don't believe in affirmative action for conservatives to get that balance. And frankly, it's going to be harder and harder if we wanted to find them. I was told by a professor at a respected Midwestern evangelical college that his college doesn't really admit many white males anymore to graduate school to do PhDs, because it knows that they will have a very hard time getting hired, and it doesn't want to hurt its placement statistics. It's very hard. I mean, white males today, you have to be twice as good as anybody else to get a job. The diversity pressure is so huge. It's in the sciences. It's certainly in law firms. It's certainly in the corporate world. You know, you have this gender fetish for corporate boards. I mean, I frankly vote against every female who shows up on a proxy ballot I receive because I assume she's there for her gender, not because she knows anything about consumer products or investment banking. So the pressure against white males is huge. I'm not saying white males are necessarily conservative, but there is already a selection going on in the intellectual world to groom more people like themselves. So it's a very tough nut to know how to crack. I think starting new institutions is a good thing. You know, Americans are very generous. The amount of money they pour into not just their schools, but social uplift. We're all supposed to hear that Republicans are so racist. I don't know a single wealthy Republican donor in New York City that is not doing something to try and help kids in the inner city. I do not know one. They all have their pet projects to try and give these kids opportunities. And I think the money that's going into colleges now should be gathered to create a new university that would be dedicated to the selfless, loving study of our past inheritance.
We always ask our authors to send us a list of people either who influence them or who they're reading or who are some of their favorite writers. And one of the ones that you included was The Lost City by Alan Ehrenhalt. Mm-hmm. Who is that? What is that?
He was the editor, I think he still may be, with Governing Magazine, a respected public policy magazine about state government, local governments. And he wrote a book about 1950s Chicago that gets to some of the ideas we were talking about earlier, Peter, about choice. Do we have too much choice and authority? And he gives extraordinarily detailed portraits of 3 neighborhoods in 1950s Chicago. A Catholic parish, St. Nick's, Bronzeville, which was the segregated black area, and a suburb of Chicago where a lot of World War II veterans' families were moving to start up their families, called Elmhurst. And what he describes is a very different world than ours today, one that did not venerate maximal autonomy and maximal choice, whether it's in the economic sphere, which is what conservatives say, the free market. Again, this gets back to the Tucker Carlson discourse. On the liberal side, maximum autonomy when it comes to moral behavior, personal behavior. There should be no strictures on, there should be no stigma against single parenting, for instance. There should be no stigma against promiscuity. Everybody should be able to just do their own thing. Aaron Holt noticed, this was in the book was written at the time when there was a lot of talk about communitarianism. If we want community, if we want real community, that involves restricting choice. You can't have endless opportunities. He saw early on, he was anticipating this current debate. Capitalism is corrosive of traditional authority, of family. It gives children spending power. We're so rich that you now have, the New York Times had yesterday an article about pre-toddler influencers that are like out on the web promoting products. But when you had the 1950s where the teenagers now were a market, this gave them power over adults that had never existed in human history. So the market breaks things down, and of course the sort of liberationist ethos did. And he noticed the Bronzeville, the black ghetto, they embraced bourgeois values, another theme that's come up today. They joined, they created institutions, insurance institutions, social clubs, dances. They aspired to middle-class propriety. Their life was constricted by the horrors of outright bigotry, and yet they created a life that was dignified by working within tradition. And so Aaron Holt said the community and maximal choice are mutually inconsistent. We are now in this reflexive rebellion against authority, whether it's by libertarians or by leftists, and that ultimately leads people to be less, your average individual is less happy in that world.
Now, there was some morality in what you were just saying, correct, from this book?
Yes.
And I don't mean to equate these two, but in my reading about you, I was surprised to learn that you're an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you an atheist?
Well, I've never had a religious instinct in my body, ever. It's that whole discourse of the metaphysics has never interested me. I've never spent a lot of time thinking about what created the world because it's impossible to answer. I would say that I also have a personal gripe against the idea of a loving personal God and petitionary prayer. For a while, I blogged on something that I helped create called Secular Right, and one of my themes was the daily slaughter of the innocents. Every single day in natural disasters, we're going to take it outside the realm of anything humans are involved with. People are being mowed down, babies are being mowed down with congenital birth defects, allegedly under the auspices of a personal, loving God who knows everything and can control everything. So when I see individuals praying for themselves to be cured of cancer, I wonder, but the person in the hospital bed right next to you just died of cancer. Why do you think God is going to respond to your prayers for help? And he was willing to let that person who, my guess is probably as worthy as you are, die. Why? And I would notice that God gets credit for the good things and never gets responsibility for the bad things. So several years after 9/11, I think John Ashcroft said, well, God has kept us safe since 9/11. We haven't had any attacks thanks to God. Okay, well, if God prevented us from being attacked on 9/11, then why did he allow 9/11 to happen? But he's never held responsible for that. And I would further argue that the conservative discourse that grounds, to the extent that it grounds certain conservative truths about family, about stability, about respect for law and order, in biblical injunctions, and says Holy Writ is what's necessary to ground this, you're not going to persuade people who don't believe in the revelation that the New Testament is correct. You're not going to, I mean, Jews don't believe the New Testament is correct. These are the most rational people in history. They don't believe Jesus is the Son of God. So Jews are atheists when it comes to the New Testament. And I'm an atheist when it comes to the Old Testament as well, and the Quran. But you're not going to persuade somebody who doesn't believe by saying, well, this is because it's in the New Testament. I'm amazed when I hear Republican politicians get up and start talking about, you know, Jesus, because not everybody believes in Jesus. So I would ground the conservative truths about the family above all, about the fact that children need mothers and fathers, in what civilization has learned over eons about how you raise self-controlled, law-abiding children. And I think that Aristotle understood virtue is inculcated through habit. I doubt whether many parents say to their 7-year-old son, don't hit your 3-year-old because Jesus said you don't. I think they said, don't hit your 3-year-old son. You've got authority. You use your parental authority. And I think the golden rule of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, the Kantian concept of being able to think rationally about what are the rules that will guarantee the most civil society, are available to human beings on the basis of reason rather than alleged divine revelation.
But isn't the Bible, is the Bible a part of the Western canon, and aren't the so-called Judeo-Christian values what has made the West what it is today?
The Bible is absolutely part of the canon, and you cannot read Western literature up through the 19th century without being immersed in that language. But I can treat that as a narrative structure without necessarily believing that it is revealed truth. I also disagree. I debated Robert Novak, who's passed away, but he's a Catholic theologian and a neoconservative, you know, so he was very politically involved. And, you know, he's part of a discourse that would say things like charity is uniquely a Christian virtue. And I just don't think that's the case. I don't think that people were not charitable before, you know, the 1st century BC. I think that those are human virtues that have evolved evolutionarily. The course of history through the Enlightenment. Tolerance is not a religious virtue. Tolerance is an Enlightenment virtue. I would say the state of the religious, the embodiment of religion is religious war. If you really believe that these are life and death truths, the Crusades are perfectly justified. Tolerance, the idea of tolerating other faiths, that's not inherent to religion. That was something arrived at through the development of Enlightenment reason.
Jeff's in Shelton, Washington, and you're on with author Heather McDonald.
Thank you. Ms. McDonald, I wanted to ask you what you think could be done to reduce the amount of bullying in public schools today. With cyberbullying, it seems like it can be deeper and more nasty and more anonymous. Worst case scenarios, it leads to teen suicides and in some extreme cases, school shootings. I'd also like to ask you personally, were you ever bullied as a young student, or did you ever bully anybody? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, I remember in the 4th grade, our class did bully a boy, And as I recall, the teacher actually was sort of complicitous in us locking him in the attic closet. So yes, I've observed that bullying. It was not particularly vicious. This was back in the 1960s. But I would say what can be done is just a constant emphasis on civility and restraint, and an awareness of language, a sense of dignity, and not allowing students to be aggressive towards each other. And this again gets to the point of the anything goes, let it all hang out Rousseauian view that somehow it is civilization and society that corrupts individuals, that man in his natural state is a noble savage and is kind and generous, and it's the strictures of civilization that result in oppression. It's just the opposite. Human beings come into the world as rabid egotists. The self is all, and it's only through the process of acculturation, of conforming yourself to certain expectations, that you learn to expand the range of sympathy to a larger and larger group of people. So I don't know, I've not taught school. I guess I would have it like a sort of a zero tolerance approach. On the other hand, I don't think you can teach niceness, so I don't know. This is something that's outside of my realm of expertise, but certainly again, to bring it back, I would say the current discourse that we're living in of identity politics doesn't help either, because that is, and kids are learning at earlier and earlier ages. There's affinity groups at earlier and earlier ages about group identity. That does not help.
Schaum's Outlines, German Grammar, Patrick Hamilton, The Slaves of Solicitude, Esther Waters, George Moore, and Richard Vedder, Restoring the Promise, Higher Education in America. Those are the 4 books that Heather McDonald is currently reading. I got nothing. That's a variety?
Yes.
Okay.
I tend to favor fiction, and I tend to favor earlier fiction because I think the language is of a more exquisite quality. The latest book of fiction there is The Slaves of Solitude by Patrick Hamilton. That was written, I think, in 1948. I alluded to that earlier. A story of a boarding house on the outskirts of London during the Blitz, and Hamilton's insight into sexual politics between females is just astounding, and his taking you into the petty cruelties of this boarding house environment is just an extraordinarily insightful into human society. And you've got American GIs that are coming into London with their drinking, but it's a very, it's funny and to a certain extent claustrophobic about the sort of petty sadism in human communities. But again, it is such a refutation of the idea that only females can understand female psychology.
Let's go to German grammar.
Okay. I put that in because I want to fight back. I'm going to Switzerland in May, and I'm getting my German back. I studied languages in college.
How many do you speak?
Excuse me?
How many do you speak?
Well, I'm okay with French, German, and Italian. Spanish, not so great. And I tried learning Latin in my senior year of college, and I was completely foundered on it. But I had the privilege of learning German at Middlebury Summer School, which is very regulated. And the point of my putting in Schaum's, which I am looking at again, we are currently living under this falsehood that you can learn a language by not working, by listening, you know, the Babbel and all these other self-help, teach yourself languages. You just listen and it's so easy, they say. That's the literal pitch. No, you need to memorize, learn grammar, learn the case endings, drill, and Schaum's, if you want to learn a language, hope that you've got a Schaum's for that language because it has exercise books. I tried to teach myself after graduating Czech and Portuguese, and it just was so frustrating because the materials were so lousy. So if you can learn German by subjecting yourself to some hard work, and these are great study guides.
Ken's in Richmond, Kentucky. Hi, Ken.
Good morning. Thank you for the call, Paul and Heather. A little background real quick, because I see that we're getting kind of close. I'm a retired military officer, spent 30 years in the Marine Corps. And the background on this is where I'm going to go with the comment and a question, please. Anytime I deployed to a foreign country, Middle East, Far East, whatever, I always went to some indoctrination of the culture to understand where I was going and the norms. I retired from the Marine Corps in 1998 and immediately went to work at the Centralized Police Training Academy here in Kentucky. I focused on leadership and ethics, and I know that's a broad term, but leadership and ethics, and I focused a lot on James West's three-step model. But here's my question. In regards to your work in regards to police work and law enforcement and criminal justice in our country, I have a feeling after 20-plus years of this that our police training could be revised. Sometimes I believe that we focus too much on the skills part and not enough on the human part. For instance, if there's let's say there's a 24-week police training academy.
Hey, Ken, I apologize to you. Can you go ahead and get right to the exact question so we can move on to you guys?
I would just say that police need constant training in tactical skills, in taking cover. They need real-life simulation, but they certainly need training in communication skills and de-escalation. Cops are not racist, but they do develop really obnoxious, hardened attitudes on the street, and they need constant refocus, re-encouragement to treat everybody with courtesy and respect, and that needs to happen. But what they don't need is to waste their time on implicit bias training, which the Obama administration is putting all of the federal law enforcement through, and a lot of local agencies are wasting the precious training dollars they have on fighting their officers' unconscious bias.
Let's hear from John, who's in Los Angeles. John, you're on Book TV with author Heather McDonald.
Heather, I have a question relative to the wall and immigration. My question centers around two sentences in an article in this morning's Washington Post. And here it is. This is two sentences, a direct quote. Quote, birth rates and fertility rates, which account for the number of women of childbearing age, are at their lowest levels on record, according to the National Center for Health Statistics. The record extends from 1909 to 2016, the most recent year for which we have data. End quote. Question. In light of the fact that this problem is not going to be resolved for at least 2 generations, how are we going to regenerate ourselves as a society without, frankly, indiscriminate immigration to prevent the United States from turning into what is quickly becoming, which is a large old folks' home?
Heather McDonald.
Well, I think that we still have a fairly decent birth rate in the United States. At this point, I don't think underpopulation is a massive problem. I think that indiscriminate immigration is a far more immediate problem, imposing social costs on communities through healthcare costs, education costs, prison costs. What I see, what I've reported on in Los Angeles is the emergence of a second underclass among a lot of these low-skilled Hispanic immigrants, which isn't to say that there's not many second and third generation immigrants that are upwardly mobile, that are starting businesses, but there's far too many that are getting sucked up into gang culture. That I've spent time at the Berendo Middle School, they've got gang counselors up the gazoo there. in Pico Rivera in LA. So I just think that that's just not an answer because it brings too many other problems in its wake.
Email from Jay in Los Angeles. Do you believe that lawmakers in the U.S. with laws and policies that appear to be well-intentioned, stop and frisk, and or inclusive, all men are created equal, appear to be well-intentioned on the surface, but when it comes to minorities, these laws and policies take on a different meaning that is usually detrimental to minorities?
No, I think what's detrimental to minorities is double standards, not holding everybody up to the same expectations of high performance, and Jim Crow, separate but equal, two standards. I mean, it is no more a embodiment of equality to say that we're going to have lower academic expectations and entry requirements for blacks, which is the case in every selective school today. That's no more acceptable than to say we're going to have separate water fountains. Everybody should meet the same standard. And it is an invitation to not try as hard, not to make yourself competitive, to say, well, we just don't believe we're going to have whites and Asians have to meet this standard and blacks and Hispanics a different standard. I think that is condescending and is a racial categorization that is not fair or helpful.
Martin, Gary, Indiana, hi.
Yeah, hi. The author had made a comment about uneducated, low-skilled Mexican immigration being a national emergency. And I was wondering how she felt about the education system in the inner cities and how that is likened to the national emergency she's speaking about.
Martin, how do you feel about the education system in the inner cities?
I think it's inadequate.
And for what reasons?
You don't get the right education to compete, like the H-1B program that many of the IT immigrants come in with.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Well, I would also say that low-skilled illegal immigration and low-skilled immigration generally is also, it hurts, it drives wages down for low-skilled Americans and second, third generation immigrants. So it's definitely putting the economic pressure on people that are at the bottom rung of our economic ladder. As far as the schools go, yes, I would again recommend this Quillette article, the Public Schools' Dirty Secret. A lot of those problems are due to the unwillingness of educators to hold all students to the same standards. We now again have this very poisonous idea that subjecting black students to discipline is racist, and so we're letting troublemakers stay in the classroom that is preventing those many students that are there to learn, to succeed. I think we need high expectations. I support models, the no excuses schools like the KIPP schools, although they're getting very left-wing these days in much of their ideology, but that script behavior, because a lot of these neighborhoods, the norms of social control have broken down. Kids come into the school, they're not learning the self-control at home. The schools need to script virtually every moment of the day to teach students to stand in line, to be quiet, to pay attention to their children, and to have a very rote type of learning. It's the antithesis of the progressive education, student-centered learning, students constructing their own knowledge. It is top-down to get the reading, get the phonetics, and so yes, there's much that can be done by way of schools to be more orderly and more demanding, but I would say a lot has to come from the family culture as well, of parents that are monitoring their kids. Are they showing up at school? Are they doing their homework? And are they respecting their teacher?
All right, we've come to that time when you have to tell us who you'd like to debate. But Mary Ellen emails in, I would like to suggest for debate Ms. McDonald and Heather McGehee of Demos. I don't know if you know Heather or not. She's been on C-SPAN as well several times. But that's Mary Ellen's suggestion. Who would you like to debate?
Well, I would like to take on the president of Yale, Peter Salovey, who has been absolutely instrumental in encouraging this delusional victimology after students mobbed a Yale professor for 3 hours in 2015, cursing and screaming at him. It was the most just terrifying instance of Chinese Cultural Revolution type anarchy. Peter Salovey said in reference to this and other incidents that semester that he'd never been so proud of his students. He has taken every opportunity to validate this narrative that Yale is somehow a racist institution. I'd like to debate him.
And a reminder to President Salvi that according to Deborah Dickerson, Heather McDonald will mess with your mind and make you either up your politico-cultural game or admit you're wrong. What worries Deborah Dickerson is that so few on our side can or bother to go toe-to-toe with her. Heather McDonald has been our guest for the last 3 hours. Thank you for your time.
Thank you,
we
Peter.
appreciate
That was
it. Book TV now continues.